Hi, so my talk today is called Bridging the Virtual and the Real, and I'll talk about research that we're doing in Cornell in graphics and computer vision that tries to bridge the virtual and the real. As you heard, I just founded a company. Just a little bit about my history. I started as a professor at Cornell in the CS department in 2002. And then I went off for a sabbatical and a leave of absence just from 2016. And that's when we founded GrokStyle. We started off in Ithaca, moved into Rev in downtown Ithaca, and then we moved to San Francisco, and we were just 2 months ago acquired by Facebook. It's a visual recognition company. It was founded out of research my PhD student and I did together at Cornell. And so it's a nice, I'm happy to talk to you about the research we did and what happened to the company. So let's start with, I'm going to start with an example. I don't know how many of you saw this movie on Netflix called Anon, where they introduced the concept of the mind's eye. I love science fiction. And they introduced the concept of the mind's eye, which is a retinal display, so to speak, that gives you a mixed reality version of the world. Before I talk about that aspect of it, I should say it's a dystopian movie. There's lots of bad things about it, about this world that we live in. And I'll put a plug for Cornell CS. We have the best security group in the world, I think, that deals with privacy and security, that's thinking about issues like that. We also are in the forefront of areas like thinking about bias and fairness in AI. I'm not going to talk about any of those issues today. I'm going to focus on the technology of mixed reality and the kind of research we do in that space. But be aware that there's a lot of great stuff going on in Cornell on those topics too. All right, so in this movie, the actor, Clive Owen, the protagonist, walks through the world, and as he walks through the world, he sees information overlaid and about people, what they're doing in their private lives, unfortunately, but also information like advertisements are put on. If a car drives by, not only does he know it's a car, which he can figure out, but exactly the make of the car, the details of all of aspects of it. There's a virtual model here. They're both virtual, and different clothes are projected onto it so that he can buy something for somebody he likes. And as he's walking down the street, he sees the display of watches. There's no signs there because they don't need it. In his eye, he will be able to see exactly which watches they are. He decides he likes one of them. He can see it on his hands, see how it looks, and make a decision. So that's a high-level idea in the movie. As I said, a lot of dystopian stuff too, but let's go with that. The two areas of research that would enable that kind of technology are computer graphics and computer vision. So in computer graphics, you take a model of something like this watch shown in this wireframe mode, and then you can produce images that hopefully are so realistic that you cannot tell between the virtual and the real. That's bridging the gap between the virtual and the real. And the flip side in computer vision looks at the inverse problem. You take a picture, you don't know what it's about. As a human being, you can tell it's a watch, but you hope that the algorithm should not only tell it's a watch, that's one problem, but go beyond that and say what kind of watch it is. That's an expert level knowledge. That's a problem of recognition that computer vision looks at. In my group, we look at both of these areas of research, and I do research in both fields. So on the area of graphics, we look at visual modeling. How do you make things look so realistic that you can't tell virtual from real? And this requires modeling the shape, the material properties, how light interacts with these materials. And in fact, Cornell is at the forefront of the material properties kind of research and in rendering. We've been known for that for many decades now. So that's the visual modeling side. The inverse problem is one of visual understanding. So say you didn't know anything, you just got these pixels. How do you figure out that that's a watch? Your brain knows. How should the algorithm figure that out? And I'll talk about both of these sides. The common theme in my research there is to bring knowledge of human perception to it. So let's dive in and start looking at the graphics problem. How do we make the virtual look real? Before I start talking about that, let me step back and just back in time. Cornell is a pioneer in computer graphics. So I do want to give a shout out to the program of computer graphics, which was founded by Don Greenberg. And this was a picture that was this is a Johnson Museum, showed up in Scientific American, this picture in 1974. And it was a picture of the museum before the museum actually existed. And here was the alumni news at that time saying, what's wrong with this picture? It was that the Johnson Museum was at the wrong location on the art squad. And in fact, Cornell has pioneered work to try to bridge this virtual and real right from that time. It's been a while. And we are famous also in the business, we're famous for what is known as the Cornell box. One of these is a photograph of a real box. One of these is a virtual rendering of that box. And the Cornell box has been used as a baseline metric that you compare against for a host of rendering algorithms for the past 10 decades. So this was done in the late 80s. And just so you know, that's the real and that's the virtual. So even in the late 80s, we were looking at these problems. But that was the late 80s. Where are we now? So if you want to produce this model with this dress, you have to start dealing with much more complexity than what was there in the Cornell box. And in fact, that's been the research that the group's been doing for the past several decades. Examples of the complexity lie, there's cloth, you can see silk versus velvet, but every material in your life, whether it's jewelry you wear, your skin, your hair, food you eat, if sushi is even slightly off in its color, you will not eat it because you use that knowledge, the visual signals, to make an important determination of whether it's safe to eat or not. To produce that virtually requires a level of accuracy that remains a challenge in the community, and that's what we've been working on in our groups. So I'm going to talk about two projects. I showed you jewelry, and in fact, jewelry and food have the common property that they're materials in which light enters them and has subsurface scattering in them. And so I'll show you first what we've done in the jewelry side. So not because we're doing jewelry per se, but these materials are very hard to capture. So how do you make virtual jade look real? The inspiration for this research was actually this jade dragon seal that we had seen from Bonham's, which has exquisite beauty and has been impossible to produce in graphics when we were looking at trying to recreate them virtually. And if you look at the thin features of the dragon's face, that kind of very translucent, milky translucency was one of the things that we were trying to capture in our virtual models and couldn't at that time. So to study it, we didn't have access to the $1 million jade dragon seal. We instead had these casts of soap and wax. And the thing to note, of course, if you look at the two of them, you can see even though they're the same shape, they look very different. So why are they different? The way you study that is we shine a laser at a block of that material. So on the left, there is a laser. You capture a picture. You can say the picture is from the top down. And you see how light scatters in those media. Turns out for soap and that particular wax, it's very different. We used to call this a teardrop for the soap. It looks sort of this teardrop shape as it's scattering in the medium. And for the wax, it's actually, we were calling it an apple shape. The light goes in there, but it kind of comes back into this kind of bloom. And capturing that is what gets you to trying to get the virtual jade and that kind of appearance, as we saw in the dragon seal. So I'm not going to get into the details of what we did, but suffice it to say, once you model it, you can produce this as a virtual image, and you can see, hopefully, that the soap, particularly the glycerin soap, and the soap stacked above it, has these beautiful features that start making it look more real. There's also curacao, milk, et cetera, that we are now able to capture accurately. But I promised you that I would talk about how you could make that model look like she's wearing real clothes. So let me talk about another body of work that we've done in making virtual cloth look real. All of you looking at this can immediately tell that you have sort of a shiny brocade silk on the left and a velvety material on the right. So what are you seeing that tells you that? I mean, you've learned, your brain has been trained to learn these things. What you're seeing is there's enough highlights and gloss and shine to the silk on the left that you believe that it's probably a silky material. And on the other hand, velvet has this deep richness to its color, but when you look at the folds, there is these bright highlights, these bright little white rims on the highlights that tell you it's velvet. It's very specific to velvet. That particular behavior is called asperity scattering by the perception psychologists. So how would you capture that if you were to try to do that in a virtual model? What we realized is to capture these, lots of people have done work in trying to capture these with different models of the surfaces of these materials. And what we realized is like you actually need to get in there and understand the structure of the materials. So specifically, you can get CT scans, and that's micron resolution models now, but you can take CT scans. Here's a little swatch of velvet we have, and we got a micro CT scan of it. And I'll just show you, there's two visualizations on the right. The middle shows the slices of the CT scans as you're sweeping through them, top to bottom. And on the right, you're seeing the 3D structure of velvet. So as you go through it, you see the tips of all of these fibers that are jutting out of the substrate in velvet. And in fact, that's why velvet is so soft and velvety, because we like that fuzziness about it. So that's velvet. And in contrast, let me show you how silk looks. Silk is tight, interwoven warp and weft that are very flat, a very flat structure. And in fact, it's because this tight, flat structure that actually makes it shiny, because all the fibers and yarns are aligned in exactly the right way. So once we had this insight, we were then able to produce images of velvet and silk. And I should just mention, if you think that CT scans are, well, that's quite the endeavor to take CT scans. Getting those are going to be like going to the Kinko's in a few years. They're increasingly getting portable. It costs you $200, $300, and then you have a scan that you can use for a variety of purposes. So that's one of the beauties of using these new imaging modalities, that we can get lots of rich data of the physical world we live in. One thing that's interesting also we found is, contrary to how people think of it, where they don't quite think of the structure and only think of the optics, you just need one photograph. Once you have that rich structure, with one photograph, you can produce a virtual silk model that captures that appearance. So I'll show you, there you go. I'll show you sort of the videos, and you can see we're capturing the highlights of silk, we're capturing the highlights of velvet, exactly that asperity scattering that I said makes a difference. In the next one, I'll show you a zooming in onto pillows where you can really see the 3D structures. So in a world where we think we're going to be living completely in this mixed reality world, you can almost touch that surface there, and you feel like you can understand the structure of the material. So I want you to know two things in this particular slide. One is many of you own bedding that looks like the one on the left. I don't know if you know this, though. For that particular pillow, it's actually one yarn. It's a one green color. The reason you're seeing two different colors there, it's entirely based on the structure of how it's woven. And so a good textile designer knows this, but most people don't know that. And when simple models that try to model it as two different colors make a mistake, what you really need to understand is structure plus one single colored yarn. All right. And why would we be doing this level of detail where you can almost touch it? And this is where sort of it matters, because increasingly industry is moving towards virtual prototyping. So textile designers, and we've been working with them, textile designers, people who are trying to come up with the next set of fabrics. In the old days, they would have a pipeline that looked like this. They'd come up with some pattern, and they'd design the weave. There's the physical yarns. They send it to the loom. They wait for 2-3 days. Out comes the fabric. They don't like what they see. They're back to the drawing board again. And it's a very expensive and slow iterative process. What we've been doing is enabling a virtual version of that, where you have these CT databases of information that capture the structure. The designer still gives a weave pattern, but we can turn it around and give them hopefully realistic models that look realistic enough that hopefully they can then use it to make design decisions. And here are sort of two examples of virtual versus real. You can probably tell which one is which, because we're not quite all the way there, but it is close enough that textile designers are now using this kind of technology. And so it's having an impact on virtual prototyping. That's one use case of this kind of work. There's also, a lot of you have seen, there's a move in the retail industry to try to add things like smart mirrors. The idea is you walk up to a mirror in the store, you have something on, and you want to try different colors of it. You want to try different variations. You can also see in this particular demo that the example of fabric that's shown in the mirror is actually quite awful. It doesn't give a good appearance of it. But that's the vision that we want to get to, is can you actually visualize these garments and apparel so that it feels like the same experience as having tried it out. We still have a long ways to go on that, but we're taking great strides to actually get there. Haptics actually play a role. So how it feels and the feel of fabrics remains a big area of interest too, but we're starting to make progress towards it. So that's the graphic side of the work that I work on. I'm now going to switch over to thinking about looking at the visual understanding side. So the idea there, remember, was when you walk up to this display, the protagonist doesn't know what watches they are, and the algorithm sends to his brain the information of extreme detail of the kind of model of watch he's seen. This goes beyond human knowledge, where we just have a watch, to expert knowledge. And this shows up at of course, apart from the movie, it shows up in many environments. For example, here's a snapshot from House. If you've ever redesigned your home or done any remodeling, people spend hours and hours of their life trying to get design inspiration online, trying to look at things and say, gee, what is that countertop? What is that chandelier? And typically a designer, if they have the time, might give them that information. We were looking at this area unfolding and thought to ourselves, it'd be great if we had visual recognition algorithms that could actually solve that problem. And that's where the work that we did for GrokStyle came out. So the problem that we looked at, we rolled it out in 2015, the paper, and then the company started in 2016 based on this core research. So we said, imagine that you see something nice, either in a catalog or in a friend's house, and you like this, you don't know what it is, it's weird looking, you can't describe it verbally very easily. So wouldn't it be great if you could just query your phone and say, what is this? And out should pop the answer. It turns out it's a fire pit, and in fact, it's this specific one, the Great Bowl of Fire. And you can, it's sold by so-and-so person, and you should be able to just click and buy it. That was sort of the use case that we were thinking of at that time. And this problem is called fine-grained object recognition. So object recognition is recognizing that it's some sort of a patio thingy, and the fine-grained part is actually giving you the details of exactly what it is. So how do you solve the problem? I'll actually try to give you an intuition of what's the hard challenge. Now, it's based on deep learning, and all of you have heard so much about deep learning. I'll actually try to give an intuition of how we built up the algorithm. The challenge, why is this difficult? So if you look at the problem from our point of view, you have these beautiful pictures that come from product websites, catalogs, et cetera, which are on the left. And on the right are real-world photographs that designers have taken or people have taken and posted on social media. And you can see the right-hand side images are messy. They're called in-the-wild images, not on Safari, just in the wild as out there in the real world. And on the left are the very clean, iconic product images. And you can see for that fire pit, it looks very different. The bottom row is 3 fire pit pictures, and it looks very different. But you as a human being, your brain just knows they're the same thing. You don't need much more than just looking at that. The colors are different, the resolutions are different, everything. So to train the algorithm to do what your brain is doing, we use deep learning using a particular network, and we teach the deep learning network to try to do what your brain is doing in recognizing that they're the same thing. So specifically, we're learning what is called an embedding, which is a very high-dimensional map. And just think of it as a map. And you can think of every picture or every object in the world has some sort of visual signature that represents its identity. So it's fingerprints for you that represent you quite uniquely. Each of these objects has its own visual signature. And what you want to learn is where in this map that visual signature projects. So for this bowl, it projects there, and all of these things, however different they look, should have that same visual signature and identity, and should therefore land up at the same place in the map. That's the high-level intuition, and the way the algorithm does it is it pulls all of these visual signatures together in the map, and it pushes everything else away. It's just as simple as that as an idea, and of course, 2 weeks of, actually months of training at some point, and lots of data, but we won't get into that. That was also part of the innovation. And then other things have different visual signatures. They go to different parts of the map. So for example, these go to different places. Once you learn this map, you're in place to actually solve that question of what is it. Just like your brain takes all those different images and projects it to it's that same thing, it's this fire pit. This algorithm also learns when you ask what is it, it'll go to this part of the map and say, gee, I know that that's where you belong, therefore you are actually this particular fire pit, Great Bowl of Fire. That's the high-level intuition. So I'll show you one of my favorite. I'll just show this result because I really like it. We tried it on different things. There's lots of evaluations. But if you take this picture and query that particular chair, why is this a hard chair? It's almost completely transparent. So essentially, any picture of this chair basically is a picture of the background of the chair with a little stuff added on top that tells you it's a chair. You can deal with it. But using these algorithms, we can also now deal with it. So when we run that query, we do get 3, they're called these ghost chairs, they're very popular. And in fact, the third query is exactly the right one because it has the right handles too. Okay, so with that, we actually launched our visual search along with IKEA last year in their augmented reality app. And I'll show you sort of what kinds of things you can do when you're thinking about designing your home. So step 1, you have, say, this particular chair in your house. We can immediately tell you what's in it, but we can also let you try different variations, for example, these. So you can imagine remodeling your home, trying other alternatives. If you combine this with a recommendation-based system, which we did, then you can also get suggestions of things you can pair. with that item. And this actually it turns out is very important. Lots of people are extremely style challenged. I mean, it's all very well to look at designer pictures, but then bringing it into your own home has its own difficulties. And actually, the thing that I like about this is we might democratize style. We're getting beauty into everybody's life. You don't have to be a spectacular designer yourself. We'll let you actually give you the technology to help you achieve beauty in your own life. And we have not yet done this, but the long-term vision is that you can imagine having a designer that takes your preferences and tastes and gives you suggestions, so it's not your job to sit there and try to figure out the thing that you're not particularly good at. So that was what we were doing on visual recognition. And the company, as I said, recently got acquired. Can we step back and do more with this kind of data? And so alongside, there's a body of work that now I'm going to talk about that we've been doing at Cornell, which is trying to look at what's the next thing you can do when you have recognition at scale available. So just to give you an idea of the data, and you've all seen this, you know it, you probably contributed to that 95 million number yourself, but there's an immense amount of data recording our lives, our daily lives. Every one of you is putting 95 million images per day on different platforms where you're sharing different aspects of your life with your friends and with the world when you make it public. These images tell us a lot about how we live as a species. What do we wear? What do we eat? What do we do when we hang out with our friends? All of these together. And in fact, if you track the kinds of things we post, it can even tell you something about how your behavior changes over time. So what we've been working on, something we call visual computational anthropology, and we're actually working with cultural anthropologists in Cornell who are looking at trying to correlate this great amount of information and wonderful data about how people are living, use that to understand how it interacts with cultural events, the culture in general, and society in general. And I understand there's lots of issues with, again, I'll say again, there's lots of issues with being careful about respecting people's privacy, et cetera, which remains something that we also think about, though I won't touch on that in too much detail today. I'm happy to chat about it. So I'm going to look at one of the questions. What do people wear around the world? So what we did here is we had Instagram data at that time when it was available to us, and we collected 8 million selfies that people posted of themselves from 36 cities around the world. And we analyzed them for 12 clothing attributes. This was actually a very simple analysis. There's a lot more we can do here. But if you take those 8 million photographs and look at all of those images there, and then put it back to, remember that map I was doing for different furniture? You can do that also with the clothes that people are wearing. And we actually blur out the images of the faces, just focus on the clothing that they're wearing. And it turns out when you look at that map, at different parts of the map, you see things like people are wearing stripes, people are wearing plaids, people are wearing jackets and layers, et cetera. So this is great. It tells you something of how people are dressing around the world. But you can dig a little deeper, and it actually becomes quite interesting. So on this axis, I'm going to take these style clusters. So take a point on that map, and you can look at a set of the nearby pictures in that point on the map, and show a plot on the X and Y axis there, which city lights up with that particular image, and also at which month of the year. Okay, so the Y axis is month, and the X axis is city. It turns out when you look at these style clusters, that kind of month-city graph shows a lot of interesting behavior. For example, the top row shows a very, very distinctive headdress that actually shows up in Lagos. The second two rows show this very distinctive head covering that is worn in Cairo and Jakarta. And the third actually doesn't show behavior that's specific to any part of the world, but is specific, as you can see from the graph, is specific to times of the year. So in fact, it represents winter. That's when people start wearing those hats and those dark jackets and those extra layers. So that's one thing. And we got really excited by these style clusters. You may have got up in the morning and thought to yourself, I wonder what I should wear. I'll wear a blue shirt. Turns out the whole planet agrees with you. That's a safe bet. So this graph shows things that are not distinctive of space or time. Blue shirts, everybody wears them. They're just a good bet. Black shirts. T-shirts, black T-shirts with some sort of graphic on them. And plaids, so the Scots should be very proud. They have had a universal effect with plaids that are everywhere in the world, no matter which country and which time of the year. But this also intrigued us. We started to think, can we look at anomalous behavior in this? And in fact, it came from one particular trend we saw. So we were plotting all of these behaviors, and we looked at T-shirts. We were looking at T-shirts, and we saw yellow T-shirts with graphics, and the graphs just went crazy at some point of the year. Anybody knows what that is? What happened in 2014 at that time? Brazil, that's exactly right, World Cup. So indeed, if you then go dig into so there's this giant spike, you go and you poke around in the data and you find, sure enough, at that time in the year, lots of people in different parts of the world, but particularly in Brazil, had World Cup fever. And that has led us to sort of more recent work we've been doing on trying to do trend detection and prediction to catch exactly this kind of anomalous behavior. So this is work that is as yet unpublished. We actually submitted a paper 4 days ago on this, but we started looking at just detecting trends where you have anomalies for different attributes. So on the top graph, you can see there's something funky going on in Bangkok with yellow, and there's something going on in Seattle with no sleeves. And it turns out both of them correspond to cultural events that I actually didn't know about till we saw the graphs, and now we can automatically find all of these events. So specifically in Bangkok, in the beginning of December, they celebrate Father's Day, which I didn't know, because it happens to be the king's birthday at that time. And so all of them wear this dad T-shirt. This dad yellow T-shirt is a big visual feature of Father's Day there. For Seattle, there's a particular spike not at Halloween, but around Halloween. And so it's different from Halloween. And it turns out it's something called Freak Night, which I also didn't know about, but they do Freak Night Festival. And apparently that's a thing. And there's apparently also a distinctive visual look to Freak Night. And that's the look. And in fact, you can go further. So we found other things. So we already looked at the top two. There was a Songkran festival. We found the Stanley Cup. Everybody was dressing in those reds in Chicago. We also found already, you heard about the World Cup in Brazil. But you can go beyond that. We found, apart from sporting events, we found something that, again, we hadn't expected. There's something called Catalan Way. I don't know if you know, at that time, there was a big movement for freedom at that point, and there was a long human chain, miles long, and they all dressed in yellow, and the data, again, pops it right out. So this is exactly where we started working with our friends who are working on thinking about cultural events and sociologists and anthropologists about the kinds of political correlation between how people are dressing, what they're posting, and understanding how their lives are being affected by the world around them using just this visual data as a source. And when you look at world events, a lot of things pop out. You can see Fashion Week shows up in Paris. You can see different, Durga Puja shows up in Calcutta. There's Stanley Cup. There's other kinds of special events at different parts of the world in different times that just pop out of this analysis. So I'm going to wrap up and just say this area of visual understanding and discovery is really exciting. There is a lot to learn when you couple we as human beings are posting our lives online, for better or worse, but that is what we are doing. And there's a lot of amazing information about the human race and how we interact with each other, what kinds of activities we do, that we're learning about and then working with sociologists and anthropologists to put in context and understand the implications of. There's still the work on improving these. So in the future work that we've been working on is first getting better at this kind of visual discovery. You still need to, it's not at the human level yet. It's good, but we are incredibly complex beings in how we understand the world, and it'll be great to design those. And there's actually connections to neuroscientists and how human beings actually perceive the world that we're doing at Cornell with some of our colleagues from the perception, from the psych side. And on the other side, we're looking with folks in sociology and anthropology, but also ecology. So when you start looking at these visual features, there's a lot of bio data and bioclimate data that also can be analyzed using similar techniques that you can start thinking about changes over time, trends, and then where trends are violated and anomalous events happen, and what implications that has on biodiversity, et cetera. So that's the broad area of research we're doing at Cornell, which I'm really excited to share with you. I should say they do all the work. So these are my students, and I have had the good fortune of working with amazing students. And so that's their work, but it was my pleasure to share it with you.